Bismillah, alhamdulillahi, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to another session. We're going to be finishing off the chapter on wudu and look at some things related to filth within the wudu and what breaks the wudu. So I'm going to go through the list again and then we're going to go through the steps one by one. So the following things break one's wudu. Anything that exits from the two openings, namely the penis, vagina and the anus. Filth that flows from other than the two openings, such as blood. Vomit, a mouthful or more. Sleeping in a position such that the backside is not firmly planted onto the ground, such as while lying down or leaning on one side. Loss of consciousness. Insanity, drunkenness. Laughing out loud by an adult in the ritual prayer. Contact between an erect penis and a vagina without a thick barrier. All these are nullifies and they return back to the one meaning of filth exiting from them. I'm going to explain this in a minute, but let's have a look at laughter. Now, Imam Shanabulali says all of them return back to the idea of filth. But laughter, how does laughter refer back to the idea of filth? Right? The reason laughter is being put in here is because it's a severe condemnation. There is a hadith by Rasulullah about laughter, and we're going to go into that, explaining that when we get to laughter. But prayer is a serious thing. So if you're laughing in your prayer, not only does your wudu break, your prayer breaks. Not only does your prayer break, your wudu breaks as well. But everything else goes back to the idea of filth. So how, you may ask, does drunkenness and unconsciousness return back to the meaning of filth? Well, if you're drunk or you're unconscious or you've been overcome by temporary insanity, you're not aware of your senses, you're not aware of what you're doing. So there is the possibility, the real possibility, that you could have passed gas. Mostly it's gas, or you could have wet yourself and be not aware of it, obviously, if you're in that state. So then we don't question. The minute that state overcomes you, we say that your wudu has been broken and you need to make your wudu again. And again, we'll look at that as we go on. So things that nullify wudu. So we have action nullification, and then we have effective nullification. So an action nullification is exiting of filth from the private parts, filth flowing from elsewhere, and vomiting a mouthful or more. So that's an action nullifier. So the exiting of filth from the private parts, it's fairly obvious. Filth flowing from elsewhere, we'll explain, and vomiting. And then you have effective nullification, such as sleep if not seated, loss of intellect, meeting of the private parts, laughing out loud in prayer. So remember these two qualifiers now, and let's have a look in depth. So the exiting of filth. So again, two categories. So if filth exits and appears, so for example, your private parts, your wudu is nullified if filth appears at the end of the organ, or it appears on your private part. So if any urine, feces, blood, and we'll go through the categories, appear on your organ, on your member, whether male or female, your wudu has been broken. Elsewhere on the body, it needs to flow, right? So filth, blood, should we say blood, needs to exit, and then it needs to flow from that for it to be nullified. So it needs to exit at the point of exit, and then it needs to flow. Anything that exits from the private parts, so one of the following. So for example, urine, feces, blood, pus, stones, worms, pre-ejaculate fluid, semen, and gas. All of these apply, but gas doesn't apply to women from the front. It's overlooked, it's not taken into consideration. Obviously gas, whether male or female, from the back nullifies your wudu. From the front for a female it doesn't. Bleeding from elsewhere. So blood must come out and have moved. So what does that mean? It means if I get a cut here, like a paper cut, or I've got eczema or some kind of skin condition, and blood, or I prick myself and then you see the blood well up. Blood comes out, I can see the blood swelled up a little bit, but it hasn't moved from its location. As long as it's not moved, my wudu hasn't broken. So the same goes for blood anywhere in my body. So if for example, I've cut myself here, or I've cut myself on my finger somewhere, and the blood comes out and I stop the blood, straight away the blood has, I can see the cut now and I can see the blood, but it hasn't started to well and move. It hasn't started to move. In that state, if I quickly stop it, right, and I hold on to it long enough, say 30 seconds to a minute, that after that, if I take my finger off, there's no blood and the blood has now stopped. That's okay. The blood didn't exit, didn't move, so my wudu is intact. But if, say, I get a tissue and then I wipe, some more blood wells up, then I wipe, blood wells up, then I wipe. Obviously, that is, I'm stopping the flow of blood. That blood would have welled up enough to have started moving. So my wudu would have broken. So like wiping, drying, or dabbing. If blood stopped from coming out, wudu is not nullified. We just mentioned that. Outside the body, not inside. So for example, if somebody punches me really hard, what's a bruise? A bruise is internal bleeding. So if I were to bleed from inside, you could see the bruise spread, right? But it's not on the outside surface of my body. So we don't look at what's inside, we look at what's outside. So for example, basically anything that I wash in a ritual purificatory bath, we're going to go into that next, inshallah. Anything that I wash is basically what's on the outside. So I'm going to wash everything that's on the outside. Anything that bleeds from the outside, that includes my mouth and nose, because they are also to be washed when I have my purification bath. So anything exiting from my mouth, from my nose, and from the outside of my body will nullify my wudu if it flows. So obviously we're not looking at blood in the eye or underneath the eyelashes, the eyelids. We're not looking at blood from the lungs, internal bleeding, blood in the stomach. I've got a bleeding ulcer, or the like, or underneath my fingernails. Sometimes you can have fresh blood. You just cracked your knuckle, you've broke your fingernail, and you've smashed the fingernail, and you can see the fresh blood underneath the fingernail. That's not counted. If you have black, it's not counted. So when is blood filthy? The legal definition here of filthy. If it flows, actual or effective, then it's filthy. So if blood appears or it flows, actual or effective, actual means it's actually flowing. Effective means that it would have flowed but you stopped it. So for example, I get enough bleeding that I know that blood would have carried on flowing had I not kept dabbing it or wiping it. That's effective bleeding. So it's considered filthy and it breaks your wudu. If it doesn't flow, then it's pure and it doesn't break wudu. Now pure in the legal sense here for the purposes of breaking your wudu, your obligation. So again, if I pinprick, I can see the redness. I've got a paper cut, or I've got cracks due to eczema or dry skin, and I can see the blood. Each time I do that, I stretch the skin and I can see fresh blood, but it hasn't come out and flowed. In that instance, my wudu will not break. So bleeding inside the mouth, we mentioned. Bleeding inside the mouth, it depends on how much. So again, the ruling is it must have flowed. How do I know this? Has the blood been overcome by saliva? So again, the blood needs to overcome the saliva. The natural color of the saliva is a transparent liquid. So, for example, if I'm brushing my teeth with a miswak, many people, when they brush their teeth, they can see blood on the toothbrush, blood in the sink, blood on the miswak. You bite an apple, you'll see blood sometimes. And a banana, you'll see blood sometimes. Gingivitis, bleeding gums. We don't look at this. We basically look at how much blood is in your saliva. So, taste. Sometimes you can taste blood. It's got a salty taste. You spit and you see it. Sometimes you taste blood, but there's no blood. In an instance like this, we don't take that into consideration. However, if you spit blood and the blood is pink or red or yellow. Now, yellow means that the saliva is still more than the blood. You've got a bit of blood and it's kind of turned a tinge like a yellowish color, we don't take that into consideration. But obviously, if that blood was to carry on, your saliva would become pink or red, and then we say it's been overcome by the saliva, and in this instance, your wudu has been broken. So the idea is obviously blood flowing, right? The same applies for your nose. If you get a nosebleed, your wudu has been broken. Vomit. Now, vomit breaks your wudu if it's a mouthful or more. And a mouthful is something that it's difficulty keeping again. You know, like it's like, what do you do with it? It's a lot. It doesn't break your wudu if it's less than a mouthful. So let's say, for example, I've got reflux, or I've eaten some spicy food and I've burped, and sometimes, you know, you get the hydrochloric acid coming up, and you know, it tastes really bad, and then it's not enough that you can actually bring it up and spit it out. It just, you just kind of gulp and it goes back in. That's okay. Or if I'm sick and I feel nauseous, I've eaten something wrong, or I'm generally sick, and then I get the gag reflex, and a little bit comes out, right? Either I sorted it back in, or I've spat it out. My wudu hasn't been broken, and then say 5 minutes later, again a little bit comes out, a little bit comes out, a little bit comes out. Little bits of small vomit do not break your ritual ablution unless they amount to a full mouth, right? And they could be interspersed by hours depending on the time that you've been overcome by that condition. So for example, if I'm in a state of nausea that lasts from 9 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock, 3 hours straight, I've been feeling sick. You know, I'm kind of a little bit incapacitated. I can't move much. I feel sick. You know, I keep wanting to throw up. In an instance like this, that time frame is one time frame, and then we count the amount of vomits in that time frame. If, however, I recovered for half the day and I still happen to keep my wudu from the morning, and then say towards 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, again it starts. That's considered another sitting, right? Another overcoming. So then we don't add this with that. We look at them as separate. Sleep and drowsiness. So sleep. Now, if you're rare, for example, I'm sitting like this, and if I fall asleep like this, my wudu will not break because my ray is firmly planted on the seat. The idea is gas escaping. When you sleep, remember we mentioned in the beginning, it goes back to the idea of filth, right? So if I sleep, who's to say I've passed gas or not, right? So we don't check, we don't investigate, you know, we assume it's possible, we make wudu again. So in this instance, if I'm sleeping, and this normally happens if I'm on a plane journey, a bus journey, it happens, car journey, you're sitting in the mosque waiting for prayer and you doze off. It happens often. In this instant, if you're sitting with your seat firmly planted, your wudu will not break. And there are two opinions in our school. One opinion is that you shouldn't be leaning against anything, right? So there shouldn't be anything there. And then the second opinion is okay, even if you lean against something. So even though, like I'm leaning against, there's a backrest on my seat. So if I fall asleep like this, I'm leaning against the backrest, my wudu will not break. The other opinion that says your wudu will break, the understanding is, had that back seat not been there, I would have collapsed, right? So I would have fallen asleep literally and kind of gone back onto my side enough that my rear would have been exposed, and my wudu would have been broken. So there are these two opinions. You can follow any one of the opinions, but your wudu doesn't break. It's also a strong opinion that that if there is a cover behind you, if you're leaning against something, it's fine, absolutely fine. Now, drowsiness, if it's light, then what does that mean? The same way is when you're sleeping. If I'm kind of dozing off here and I go to sleep, for a certain amount of time, I will be aware of my surroundings. So if somebody calls me, I'll wake up. I'll be able to distinguish most of the conversations that are going on. And even if they do become a bit hazy, I still know there is conversation going on. So in this instance, it doesn't nullify my wudu. But obviously, there'll come a phase where I can no longer hear what's going on. As I start to enter dreamland, as my sleep gets deeper and deeper, I will not be aware of what's going on. In this instance, my wudu has been broken. So light, can hear most things, doesn't nullify wudu. Heavy, can't hear most things, nullifies wudu. Now, an interesting case here is if you sleep in your prayer motions. So for example, this is a prayer motion. You know, standing up, going into ruku is a prayer motion. Going to sujood is a prayer motion. So if you happen to be in a prayer motion and you fall asleep, you don't break your wudu. Now that sounds contrary to what I said before, which is if your rear is not seated firmly on a seat, right, then your wudu has been broken. But obviously when you go into sujood, your rear is kind of, so how can that be? Well, the understanding is really simple. If you look at this guy here in this picture, he's bowing, he's perfectly in control. So for example, he hasn't collapsed into his sujood. He hasn't collapsed, which means he's gone to sleep, right? He's resting on his body weight is distributed equally along his feet, on his knees, up to his hands, and then his head, equally distributed. He's supporting himself by his limbs. He hasn't crumpled, which means he's gone to sleep. He's in that state where he's aware. So he's aware, he's dozing, he's sleeping, but he's aware of what's happening. He's in full control. If you are in full control, like you're doing sujood without collapsing, you're doing a proper sujood with your arms spread, your forehead touching the ground, evenly balanced. In that state, if you doze off, your wudu doesn't break. Likewise, if you're standing and for example, when can this happen? When you wake up at Tahajjud, or when you're very, very sleepy. Sometimes when you wake up for Fajr and you want to catch Fajr in the Jama'ah, if there's a 10-minute recitation, sometimes a person does sway a little, depending on how much sleep they have. Momentarily, that swaying is when you've gone into that kind of sleep kind of a state. But you don't collapse because you're aware of what's happening. So in that state, you're aware of what's happening, you're kind of a bit out of it, but you're aware. You're dozing in that state, your wudu will not break. Likewise, when you go into ruku, you haven't collapsed onto yourself and done a standing split, standing forward bend. You're in control, so your hands are firmly placed on your knees, you're supporting yourself, you're at a right angle, you haven't totally collapsed. So in these three states, standing, bowing, and sujood, you're in control. As long as you're in control, your wudu doesn't break. So purification and laughter. So whoever of you laugh loudly, then let him repeat his ablution and his prayer. So the Hanafis are the only ones that basically have this rule. The other imams don't implement this in their schools, this rule of laughter. And why the Hanafis have implemented it is because it's a hadith, and it's a strong hadith for us. And the hadith is that whoever of you laugh loudly, this is to do with a story. Sorry, I should finish the hadith when you started. Whoever of you laugh loudly, then let him repeat his ablution and his prayer. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So this is it comes down to us. It's known as a mursal hadith. A mursal hadith is where you have a chain of transmission. So from here, Rasulullah at the top, and then all the way down, it's authentic. So it's a chain, like he heard from him, and then it gets to a tabi'i, and from a tabi'i, it should be a sahabi, and then Rasulullah. But there's no sahabi there. There's no companion. There's only a successor, tabi'i. Right, so in this instance, because there's no successor, there's no companion, there's no sahabi, it's only a successor. So this is known as a mursal hadith. Now these hadiths, technically from a muhaddith, right, they have their reservations about these hadiths because they're involved in a different science than the fuqaha, which are more, which are involved in different sciences. Let's explain this a bit more. So first we need to know that a mursal hadith, the early fuqaha accepted them, right? So it was only up till the 3rd century, Imam Tabari says, people were acting in accordance to mursal reports and accepting them until the opinion originated after the beginning of the 3rd century to reject them. So up to the 3rd century, before that, then everybody was accepting them. Then it became the norm, it became the fashion to not accept them. Having said that, still the early fuqaha generally accepted them. The Malikis accept them with conditions. The Hanbalis are known for using them more extensively, and the Shafi'is also accept them with conditions. The Hanafis accept them. It's a strong hadith. It's got a very strong chain. It's got an authentic chain. But just because there is the top sahabis missing, the chain strengthens itself, right? And some of the conditions that some the other schools use is the tabi'i Was he young in age or was he old in age? And they have their own classification. The ulama of the hadith did say that it's not sound, because the muhaddithin, they are concerned with the narration and the soundness of the text. So they're only concerned with the narration, the narrators and the text. Whereas the fuqaha are concerned with meanings established, right? So they're two different sciences. So just because the muhaddithin will say it's not sound, it doesn't mean that for the fuqaha it's not sound. It's fit for purpose, it's a strong hadith, it's a strong chain, it's accepted. This is something extra. It's just to kind of whet the appetite if you want to move further in your Islamic studies. Obviously, this is a mid-level book. Everything taught here is up to a certain point, but it gets more interesting the more deeper you get into fiqh. And I was taught this way, so again, I'm just teaching it the way I was taught it. Purification and laughter. So laughter will break the ablution if you're mature, you're awake, and it's audible to others. So mature here means that not a child. As you know, children often laugh in prayer. So this doesn't apply to them, it applies to a mature person, somebody who's hit puberty. You have to be awake. So again, if you fall asleep if you're standing and you really fall asleep, right? It's hard to say if you're standing. You'd have to be bowing, or in ruku and sujood, to have really fallen asleep. In that instance, obviously, if you laugh, it doesn't apply to you because you're not awake, you're asleep. Audible to others around you. If you laugh to yourself and only you hear your laughter, then your prayer breaks, not your wudu. But if others around you, so if I laugh in such a fashion, it doesn't need to be very loud, raucous laughter. It can be a slight cackle, it can be, an obvious laugh. The person around me, they've realized it's a laugh. I've laughed. In an instant like this, your wudu would break, and it needs to be in a full prayer with bowing and prostrating. What does this mean? Not a funeral prayer. So as you know, in a funeral prayer, there is no bowing, there is no prostration, there is no bowing. So it has to be in a full prayer, a prayer where you have the standing, the bowing, and the sujood, the ruku and the sujood. And a funeral prayer doesn't have this. So if audible to oneself only, then it invalidates the prayer and not the ablution. So purification and intimate contact. So that can be split into three parts. So we have intimate contact. So you have, for example, full intercourse. In a situation like this, your wudu would break, and also you need to make a purificatory bath. You need to make the purification bath, which we shall be talking about, called the ghusl, even if there's no ejaculation. So the minute you have penetration, when the male member meets the female member and there is penetration, there is full penetration, then your wudu breaks, and you need to make the obligatory bath as well. A direct contact without a barrier. So skin to skin contact where there's no penetration, direct contact without a barrier, your wudu would also break. Without a barrier means something that's so thin that you can feel body heat, right? So you shouldn't be feeling, like a thick cloth, for example, you're fully clothed. Even if there is contact, very close contact, if you're fully clothed, you won't feel body heat transfer. So direct contact without barrier. Basically, we're talking skin to skin here. No, and then the third category, which is of no consequence to us here, unless something exits, is no other contact. So, for example, kissing or being intimate with your wife. If there's nothing exits, then your wudu doesn't break. So mere kissing is on the next screen here. A person touching his own private parts. Touching filth when changing nappies, or you're a primary caregiver, or there's filth on the street, you happen to touch it to clear it away. Touching blood or pus, none of these will break your ablution. So the only two forms are the full intercourse or touching without skin-to-skin contact of private parts. So now the condition of being legally responsible. So who's legally responsible for wudu? So we've learnt how to make a wudu. We know what wudu is. We know how to make it. We know what breaks it. We've learnt the fara'id. We've learnt the recommended. We've learnt the sunnah elements. We've learnt all that now in wudu. But who is wudu? Who is legally obliged to perform wudu? That's the next part now. The conditions of being legally responsible are, for those who are obliged to perform wudu, Islam, you need to be a Muslim. A non-Muslim is not legally obliged to perform wudu, right? A Muslim, you need to be Muslim. A Muslim is legally obliged to perform wudu. And you need to have hit puberty. So pre-pubescent girl or guy, boy or girl, or younger than that, they are not obliged to make wudu. And sanity, an insane person, the pens have been lifted from him. So an insane person isn't obliged to pray. He doesn't, an insane person is insane. So the obligation of wudu is not upon him. So a woman leaving the state of menstruation or postpartum bleeding, she's obliged to pray, so she's also obliged to make wudu. As a side note here, duty of care on the parents to teach children before puberty. Now children are encouraged to pray by the age of 7 and it's enforced by the age of 10. That's because you don't want to wait until the time that they hit puberty before they learn these things. Why? Because the minute they hit puberty, if they don't start to pray, then they're sinning. If they haven't learned these things before, when it hits them, the obligations are upon them instantly, right? So they need to start fasting when the time comes, praying, and doing everything else that a regular Muslim as an adult would be doing. So in an instance like this, it's best to start teaching them. The onus is on the caregiver, on the primary caregiver. The onus is on the parents, right, to make sure that their children know these things. Because the parents, these are responsibilities, right? So you will be asked about this. If they do not learn by the time, the parents are responsible and the parents will be held accountable for this. So it's always best to teach your children these things as they approach the age of puberty. So if they're encouraged to be praying by the age of 7, that means they should know by that age how to perform a wudu and how to pray, right? And then by 10 you start to enforce it, because now it's getting very close to the time where they should really know everything and be praying. So also, being in a state of ritual impurity. If I need to pray again, I need to make wudu again. So if I'm in a state of ritual impurity, in order for me to pray again, in order for me to touch the Quran, to do a form of worship that requires wudu, I would need to make the wudu again. Access to and the ability to use sufficient purifying water. We're going to discuss this, inshallah, in the successive lessons. If you don't have sufficient water, or you cannot access water, even if it's close to you, you cannot access it, then you're not obliged to make wudu. You do what's known as tayammum, dry ablution. We'll talk about that. The ability to perform the ritual ablution. So again, if you're in a coma or you're paralyzed, sometimes you could be alone and get a back spasm which will waylay you on the ground, right? For like 2 hours, you're in a position and there's nothing you can do. And the whole time for prayer goes. So in a state like this, or if you're in paralysis and nobody can help you, you're not obliged to make the wudu. Obviously, if you're in a coma or you're unconscious, it's the same thing. The directive of the divine command applying to someone due to the near expiration of the prayer time. What does this mean? This means that, let's say, for example, that I am, the time for Dhuhr starts at, say, 12 o'clock. For our purposes, 12 o'clock. And the time for Asr starts at 6 o'clock. Right? In the northern climes, the times are long. So 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So I've got a window from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. I've got 6 hours to pray Dhuhr. There is an optimum time to pray, but legally I can pray at any time. I can pray at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just before 6 o'clock. Up to that time I can pray. Now obviously, as we're going to look in the next lesson, there is a recommended time, there is the better time to pray, the more virtuous time to pray. But for this instance, I've got this window. So I'm busy here, and then I decide to pray at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. Now, what this is talking about, is the directive of the divine command applying to someone due to the near expiration of the prayer time. So let's say I've waited till now 5:30, right? I've only got half an hour. If I were to make wudu and I were to pray, that would take, say, another 10 minutes. So, I'm still kind of okay-ish. Now it's 35 past, it's 40 past, it's 45 past, it's 50 past. I've only got 5 minutes to make wudu, 5 minutes to pray. Now it's 55 past. Now I've entered the realm of sinning, because if I do not instantly get up now and make wudu, I'm not going to be able to catch that prayer in the right time. I'm not going to be able to pray. So now then the command is upon me and it obliges me. Now you must get up and you must make wudu. If you don't do it now, you're sinning. You're going to miss the prayer totally. This is what it's referring to. The conditions of the validity of wudu are the following. Now we discussed this in an earlier session. Completely covering the skin with purifying water. We discussed this. Every area of your body that needs to be washed needs to be. So here, removing of anything that blocks the water. For example, nail varnish, glue, super glue, or paint. We need to make sure all of this is off before you make the wudu. The water needs to touch every part of the skin that needs to be washed. The ending of any state that contradicts wudu while performing it, such as the appearance of urine at the tip of the penis. So what this is referring to is the ending of any state that contradicts wudu while performing it, such as the appearance of urine at the tip of the penis. So what this is referring to is someone who's used the privy, he's cleaned himself, he thinks he's dry, he gets up, he's making wudu, and then he realizes, oh, he's not dry, a drop has appeared on his member again. So in this instant, he needs to completely dry, make sure there's no leakage or there's no filth on him, and then he needs to make wudu. So basically, before you start your wudu, you need to be in a pure state, right? Obviously, you're not in a pure state if while you're making wudu, something exits, whether it's gas or whether it's liquid or whatever. So you need to be in a pure state. When you start, you need to stay in a pure state, completely in a pure state. The legal ruling of wudu is that it makes permissible that which was impermissible before it, such as the ritual prayer and touching a copy of the Quran. This is the legal ruling here. Its pillars are its fard elements, i.e. the four mentioned. So what are the four elements we mentioned again? It's washing your face, washing your arms, a quarter of the head, and your feet. These are the four fard elements of your ritual ablution. As a final note, avoid misgivings. We don't need to go crazy. We don't need to get obsessive. We don't need to think, oh, have I missed this? Have I not done that? Am I wet? I need to check 50,000 times. Or, oh, I'm sure I missed this bit. Oh, I don't remember doing this. You get into this habit, right? And it's a self-destroying habit, right? It's waswas from shaitan. In these instances, do what everybody else does. Everybody who knows something about the religion. So go to a mosque, go to a madrasa, observe how the students of knowledge make wudu, right? Observe how the ulama make wudu, and do it as quick or as slow as they do it. But you will not find them obsessing over everything, or making sure they're rubbing 10 times, or sometimes some people might feel that, oh, they didn't do this, and then they come back and make a second wudu. This cycle is not nice, and it really can set somebody back from their practice quite a bit. And this cycle of thought is not something that's good to get into, and there's no need to get into it. And our religion doesn't demand for us to go to investigate like that or to go that deep, and it doesn't really make sense anyway. Just keep to the middle way, right? There's no extremism. There's no totally letting your guard down that you just splash and then go and pray, right? Like you see children doing. They haven't washed their feet properly, right? But an adult will make sure he washes his feet properly, right? But he doesn't obsess over it. So you're not obsessing, and you're not doing what children do. Obviously, the ones that don't know. You're doing what the people of ilm, the people of knowledge, what they do. So that's the best way. Just focus on how they do it and do it as they do it. And if you see them doing something in a certain way, just do it in a certain way. However many times you see them do it, and then finish. So no misgivings. Okay, wudu is of three types. We have the fard, the wajib, and the recommended. Now, when is wudu fard? When is it obligatory? When a person is in a state of minor ritual impurity and intends on doing any of the following, the ritual prayer. So in order for me to pray, I need to make wudu. It's obligatory for me to make wudu. The prostration of recital. There are 14 places in the Quran, verses in the Quran, where when you hear them or you recite them, you need to prostrate. So for me, in order for me to make that prostration of recitation, I need to be in a state of wudu. Touching a verse of the Quran or touching the Quran itself, it applies to the covers that are attached. So basically, we've got a Quran. I haven't got a book here. Say we've got a Quran here. So it says touching a verse of the Quran, but the all of the book is technically considered the Quran. So even though the cover doesn't have anything on it, right? But the cover is attached to the bound book. The mushaf, the bound book, is the Quran. So the cover is part of the Quran, even though there's no verse on there. I cannot touch that verse. An attached cover also. So for example, I've got a Quran with a zip. You get Qur'ans with zips. The zipper, when you open it, the cover, the ghulaf, is attached to the book. It forms part of the book. Again, I can't touch that, right? Unless I detach, which in many instances is going to rip the it's going to rip the first page, or it's going to rip the cover that it's fixed to, which again is disrespectful to the Quran. So you have to be very careful there, right? So again, do not touch the bound copy, any part of it, even a page. Even if you lift up a page and say the Quran is here and the margins are blank, you can't even touch the margins. You are not even allowed to touch the margins, right? You can't touch the verses, you can't touch the margins, and you can't touch the two covers that cover each side of those pages with the verses on it. All of that is the Quran. Unless with a detached cover, we just mentioned, don't touch any verse on paper other than the Quran. So a detached cover, for example, a detached cover is paper. So there's a Quran here on my table. It's very close to the edge. It's going to fall. I can't touch that Quran if I don't have wudu. But I can use the paper, put the paper on top of it, and kind of move it back. Or if I want to move it and put it on a shelf, I could kind of put the paper under it, over it, like that, and then take it. Or I could use a cloth, even my hat, the soft hats, but I can't touch the Quran without wudu, unless with a detached cover. The same goes for if I have a paper here and it's a leaflet, it's an Islamic leaflet inviting me to a local conference, and it's got a verse of da'wah in the front, or it's a wedding card and the wedding card has a verse of marriage on there. In an instance like that, again, I can touch the paper, but I can't touch the verse. I can't put a finger on the verse. Also, do not put the Quran on the floor. Right? Many people, you'll see that they think it's okay to put the Quran on the floor. In fact, many people think it's okay to touch the Quran without wudu also. Right? That's totally wrong. Putting the Quran is very, very disrespectful to the Quran, and it's certainly something that you shouldn't be doing. Wajib. So the second category is necessary, wajib, when a person is in a state of minor ritual impurity and intends on performing tawaf around the Kaaba. Now we mentioned wajib is one below a fard. So a decisive text with no room for interpretation, and then a wajib is a necessary is a decisive text where there's room for interpretation. So in a situation like this, circumambulation of the holy house, going around the Kaaba as a form of worship, the tawaf. In a situation like this, I need to make wudu before I do this. Now, if I didn't have wudu when I did this, would I be sinning? Yes. Would my tawaf be accepted? Yes. But I'd have to redo it again or pay the compensation. It's sacrificing a sheep or a goat, something like that. But it's easier just to do the tawaf again in wudu. Why? Because the tawaf requires that it's necessary for me to be in a state of wudu to do the tawaf. Touching a book of tafsir, Quranic exegesis, Now this is the opinion of Imam Sharambaluli. It's not the majority opinion of the school, but Imam Sharambaluli mentioned it here. The majority opinion is that if you have a book of tafsir, now most of the book will be side notes, right? Will be a commentary on the verse of the Quran. So you're probably going to get like most of the page is going to be commentary, and then it's going to be like a few ayahs. So in a situation like this, you can't touch the Quran, you can't touch that book, right? The book of tafsir, or it's like, you can't touch it. But Imam Sharambaluli says here that it's wajib to make wudu for this, but you can touch that book of tafsir. The mandub, the recommended, when a person is in a state of minor ritual impurity in the following cases, it's mandub, it's recommended to make wudu before touching a book of fiqh, jurisprudence, or its like, sacred knowledge basically. Sacred knowledge, it's recommended, it's part of the etiquettes, it's part of the preparing yourself for this huge ocean of knowledge and mysteries you're going to delve into, right? There is the proper manner to do something. There's always there's prerequisites that need to be done properly, and what starts well ends well, what begins well ends well. So to prepare yourself before a lesson of an Islamic lesson, to dress well, make wudu, apply some perfume, brush your teeth, prepare yourself for that class. Likewise, before touching a book of fiqh, to read it, to benefit from it, it's recommended to make wudu. The more you give to the religion, the more the religion gives back to you. To renew one's wudu for another ritual prayer. So if I have wudu and I made wudu for dhuhr, now asr has started, I can make wudu again even if I haven't broken the wudu. Wudu upon wudu, it's rewardful. It's recommended. To avoid disagreements of scholars of other schools of thought, such as having touched a woman. So it's given the example of having touched a woman here, because in the Hanafi school, touching anybody who's not your mahram, it doesn't break your wudu. But in the Shafi'i school, it breaks your wudu. In the Maliki school, if you touch another woman with desire, it breaks your wudu. If it's without desire, it doesn't. In the Shafi'i school, it breaks your wudu. So in the Hanafi, even though this doesn't apply to us, in our school, it doesn't apply to us. Obviously it's haram to touch a woman, right? But if you're on a crowded bus or something and you happen to brush against someone, no fault from your side, from yourself. In this instance, your wudu has not been broken. But to keep safe, and it goes back to taqwa, you make wudu again. So the other schools, it's in the Shafi'i school, it's deemed broken. So what you would do is you'd make wudu as a point of taqwa amongst yourself, because there's a disagreement. So you're kind of protecting yourself. You're kind of making sure that you're taking into account another school's principle, and you're saying, well, if it's to avoid any disagreement, as a point of piety for myself, I'm going to go the extra mile, even though my school doesn't allow it. Sorry, that's the wrong word to use. Even though my school doesn't acknowledge that, but the other school does. So as a point of taqwa for myself, as a point of piety, I'm going to respect the other school's ruling as well. And there are many instances in many times in your life when many acts of worship that you do, this will happen. And as your level of piety increases, your God-fearingness increases, and you get closer to Allah, naturally you start to take into account these differences, and you become mindful and aware of these. Before sleeping, it's recommended. There's blessing in it. You have the before sleep, you have the evening du'as when you sleep. They protect you. Wudu is a form of protection as well, and it's a point of blessing before sleeping, and then after waking up from sleep. So when you wake up from sleep, obviously most people, they get up for Fajr. Depending on what time of the year it is, you will just pray and then go to work, and your day starts. You've started your prayer. You've started your day in a good action. Other times, you may go back to sleep again. But then when you wake up in the morning, it's recommended to make wudu as your first act. You wake up, you praise the Lord, say something beautiful, a short, a verse of the Quran, or you praise your Lord. There are morning du'as from the Sunnah. Also making wudu. And then also praying a cycle of prayer. right? It's recommended. By extension, you can do many things. After every sin, so after every sin, you repent, and then you make wudu. And then again, you can follow that up with the sunnah, which is you pray 2 cycles of prayer. So for example, you've done a sin, right? And then to cover up a bad deed, you do a good deed. It's from the sunnah. So then you've made wudu again. You know, like you've done a sin, you feel kind of bad, you don't feel clean anymore. So then you purify yourself by doing wudu, right? And then you can pray the two nawafil are recommended as well. Ask Allah for forgiveness and Allah forgives. After laughing out loud outside of the ritual prayer. This, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is referring to very loud laughter that I've done. Sometimes you kind of get very heedless, you lose your senses. Sometimes you can get into a huge fit of raucous laughter. That momentarily, you've kind of gone a bit heedless. And in that state, you've kind of lost direction with your Lord. So then you turn back, you purify yourself, right? And purification is the start of many acts of worship. So naturally, most people, when they purify from themselves, what do? What's the very next action? Pray 2 cycles of prayer. So you purify yourself. It's recommended to purify yourself once your direction, your compass, your moral, your alignment has moved away from facing your Lord. So that's it for today's lesson. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.